Hi, this is Sally, and welcome to Reclaiming Pride, LGBT plus survivors of narcissistic abuse. Before we start, there is a trigger warning. The episodes of this podcast may at times refer to domestic violence, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. To begin, I'd like us to start with a one-word feelings check. That means what's one word for how you are feeling right now? Not how you are making other people feel, or how the other people around you are doing. How are you doing right now, in one word? This week, we're delving into a rather chilling aspect of narcissistic behavior, and it's how narcissists might abuse us while driving in a car. I experienced this so much in the situationship with my ex that I wanted to record a whole episode on this. As I understand it now, this is a common tactic used by narcissists and abusive people to trap someone in a speeding car and start the abuse. Being abused while in a car that's driven by our abuser can leave us feeling trapped, helpless, and isolated. In this episode, we'll explore the various ways narcissists can exploit their power over their victims on the road and the psychological motivations behind that. But first, as always, let's take a closer look at some of the common behaviors that narcissists exhibit while behind the wheel. So many of you may have witnessed or even experienced aggressive driving behaviors, speeding, tailgating, sudden lane changes, excessive horn use, and obscene gestures. These are all tactics used regularly by narcissists to assert control and intimidate their victims while driving. It not only endangers everyone in the car, but also highlights the abuser's need for dominance and complete lack of care about other people's safety. Another tactic that narcissists employ is threatening to leave their victim stranded. This can be a powerful tool for control and manipulation. Imagine being threatened with abandonment in the middle of nowhere. It's a terrifying prospect. I remember being dumped out on the side of the West Side Highway in New York City in the snow, in the middle of nowhere after she'd spat in my face a number of times and pinned me against the car in New England, and 2 miles away from our home, so I had to then walk home on a Monday night after work. I remember even her first show of physical violence was actually in a car, and I also remember her driving recklessly on highways many times, slamming on brakes to make me jolt forward as a form of physical abuse and swerving in front of other cars. That was actually an attempt to mimic my driving when she would swerve like that and brake like that, which she would sit and scream at me while I was driving. I remember her raging so hard in the city once that she swerved to the side and hit the curb. The doors were locked and she was literally screaming and my ears were ringing. She dumped me out on the sidewalk and I had to get the train to work. I also remember her grabbing me by the hair on a highway and swerving over out of breath and pulling over to carry on. That time, actually, some cops must have seen, don't know where they came from, and pulled up behind us to ask if everything was all right. I was so scared of her in that moment that I said everything was fine. They could see it wasn't fine, I think. I also think that if she'd been a man, they would have persisted with their questioning. People assume that A, you're not in a relationship because it's not heterosexual. There's 2 women in the car or there's 2 men in the car. B, that women aren't violent like that to other women. Only men do that. And C, a woman isn't a violently dangerous person like a man. All of this is wrong. Narcissists often resort to verbal and emotional abuse during car rides, yelling, screaming, insulting, and belittling their victims. Such behavior can be severely damaging to someone's self-esteem and mental health. And then there's the most extreme form of abuse where the car itself becomes a weapon, as I'd mentioned earlier. Reckless driving, sudden braking, and accelerating dangerously, all of these actions put everybody in the car's life at risk. Let's consider some of the real-life examples, apart from the ones I'd mentioned earlier. A narcissistic mother might drive erratically to scare or punish her young child in the car. A narcissistic partner could threaten to kick their partner out of the car unless they comply with all of their demands. A narcissistic person might engage in aggressive driving to feel powerful and in control. Or a narcissistic father could refuse to let the child out of the car as a punishment for saying something that he doesn't like. So what makes the car such an attractive setting for narcissistic abuse? Well, being in a car provides the abuser with a sense of isolation and control over their victim, who often feels trapped with limited options to exit the situation. This setting can be appealing for those seeking to have ultimate power over other people. Some abusers might even use the stress of driving as an excuse to vent their anger on their victims. However, it's crucial to remember that stress should never be an excuse for abuse, although with narcissists, it often is. Additionally, abusers might feel emboldened to escalate their abusive behavior in a car because it's less likely to be witnessed and intervened upon by others. This was a huge one for my ex. It was very much her MO that she'd like to get you alone and then turn on you. It wasn't necessarily in a car, but it was something that she did frequently. I remember the day that was the last straw for me. We were due to have about a 2.5 hour drive, and the abuse, yelling and berating by my ex had already begun, and we weren't even 30 minutes into the ride. It was then that we hit traffic, and she had to slow down, and then I opened the door, and I got out. The car was still moving, but it was only at a crawl, and I had to get out because that was the last time she was going to do that to me. We were on a highway, and I walked to the side and sat on the metal fencing next to the highway. She kept going. A number of people kept pulling up and asking me if I was okay, and I kept telling them that I was. It's Florida. It was 90 degrees, and I just sat there and I didn't know what to do. All I could think was, I really hope nobody from my job sees me. Eventually, a woman in an SUV pulled over and gestured for me to come over to her car, and she asked me if I was all right and seemed to genuinely care. I ended up getting back into that car with my ex, even after I called an Uber to take me in the opposite direction to take me home. In fact, the Uber driver was actually a trans woman, and she wouldn't leave me until she saw that I was safe inside the car and that I wasn't being abused again. It's funny, I didn't even need to explain anything about it to her. She seemed to just know. She didn't charge me for the call out, and she kept me on the phone until she saw me walking towards my ex's car, and she just watched. That was the last time I was abused in a car by my ex. Because, and as with all narcissists, once you make a boundary, it shocks them and they can't believe that you did that. And yet they can, though, seem to compute that the amount of abuse that they dish out is totally fine. The cognitive dissonance there is astounding. To truly understand this dangerous behavior, we need to consider the underlying issues common in narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. They have poor anger management. They have entitlement and a complete lack of empathy. These issues may make an abusive outburst while driving more likely. Now let's dive into the psychology behind why narcissists are willing to go to such dangerous lengths to win a fight. And a fight, by the way, that is completely of their own making, that would not exist if they hadn't started it. One common factor is their inability to maintain whole object relations. I've mentioned this concept in earlier episodes on intermittent reinforcement and another episode on the narcissist's emotional reasoning, which means they struggle to see others as complex individuals with both positive and negative traits. Instead, narcissists view people as either all good or all bad. So if you're that all bad person and you're sitting right there in the passenger seat, what might you imagine would happen? Another critical aspect is one which I've recorded another episode on, whole object constancy. So narcissists find it challenging to maintain positive feelings towards someone, even when they're not upset or disappointed. This lack of object constancy can trigger their abusive behavior during conflicts. Emotional empathy, as we know, is also lacking in many narcissists. Without this, they struggle to understand and relate to their victims' emotions, making it easier for them to escalate abuse, especially in a closed environment. Finally, narcissists heavily rely on external validation to regulate their self-esteem. Even minor incidents can trigger them, as they perceive it as a threat to their own self-esteem. So what should you do? If you do find yourself in a car with a narcissistic abuser, it is crucial to focus on your safety. Try to avoid escalating the fight, even if you're in the right, which you most likely are. If possible, and if you can, get out of the vehicle safely. Find an alternative way to reach your destination, or go home, or go to a safe place and a safe person away from the narcissist and where they can find you. Abuse like this is highly likely to be part of a pattern of abuse in other areas of your life as well. Finally, narcissistic car drama is a common form of narcissistic abuse. It highlights the self-centered nature of narcissists and their need for power and control and their willingness to risk dangerous behavior to win a fight, which they started. Remember that narcissistic abuse, whether in a car or elsewhere, can have lasting psychological and emotional impacts. Seek support and consider your options if you find yourself in this kind of a situation. Now, I know that this may have brought some things up for you. It certainly did for me. If you've experienced being abused in a car by someone with NPD, it could have been your intimate partner, a family member, or friend. Let's just take a break to regroup. And after that, I'll be back with a listener Q&A. I'll see you in a moment. Welcome back. This week's listener question comes from Mary in the UK, and she writes, do narcissists know that they are narcissists? So the short answer is no. I think in the case of my ex, in her borderline vulnerable moments, she knew that there was something missing and that most other people have something that she didn't. She knew there was a problem with the fact that she couldn't hold down a job, for example. But she never explored that further and was much more comfortable blaming everybody else. Narcissism is like water in that sense. It will always go back down to the lowest point. The narcissist will always err on the side of it's all other people who are abusing and are not understanding me, and that's why there's so much wrong in my life. They are very much the victim in their own story. Meanwhile, ironically, they torture other people on a regular basis. When we look from a clinical point of view, there are differing views on whether narcissists are aware of their own narcissism. So many experts believe that in most cases, narcissists lack the self-awareness and don't recognize their own narcissism. Their grandiose sense of self prevents them from seeing themselves clearly. They may be blind to how their behavior affects others, in other words. However, some theorists argue that narcissists do have some awareness of their selfishness and entitlement, but then they quickly rationalize that or blame it on others. Their public persona may differ from their private self-image quite wildly, as I described earlier in relation to my ex. A narcissist may have moments of clarity where they gain insight into their narcissistic traits, but this tends to be only temporary. As I've mentioned before, their core personality remains unchanged. Overt narcissists who actively seek attention and admiration may be more conscious of their narcissism, whereas covert narcissists who are shy but still feel grandiose entitlement may have less self-awareness. Even if narcissists recognize some of their behaviors, they're really unlikely to seek change. They feel their narcissism is justified or working for them. It's as simple as that. So in summary, complete lack of self-awareness is common in narcissists, but some may have flashes of insight into their self-centeredness without it actually fundamentally changing anything to do with their abusive personality. Their level of awareness can vary. So, Mary, I hope this helped to answer your question. If you would like to ask a question and have it answered here on the podcast, you can post it on the Instagram or Facebook accounts for this podcast, and they're linked on the website banner. Please note, this podcast is not intended to replace professional therapy or counselling. It serves as a supplementary resource for support and encouragement. Listeners, you are encouraged to seek professional help if needed. I did, and it still works for me every day. Stay tuned, and I look forward to healing with you again next time. Bye-bye.